when did you learn that you were autistic? And what has it been like to get to know your brain?
I only recently had somebody else say, "Hey, you're right, you're autistic." Um, so I don't even think it's been like 6 months that I've comfortably said it to other people, and feeling confident, no, I got someone backing me on this.
Right.
But I have always questioned my neurology because of the things, because people do the things so easily, and it always befuddled me. Just in school, how do you just walk in on the first day of school and just do the things and not be freaking out? How does that happen?
When I knew I was autistic, I was late diagnosed in January after my physical, which is age 23.
Okay.
And that was, when, the SSI and SSDI program wants to make sure that, to continue, I had to go to a psychiatric to continue my benefits. And that was, through the healthcare provider, and that was by law.
Mm-hmm.
And that experience, and I found out that I was autistic then. But like I said, I've also had multiple disabilities that, ADHD when I was young.
Mm-hmm.
Then, dyslexia within that ADHD form. And then, cognitive speech issues, stuttering of my own words.
Mm-hmm.
That is when I knew I was different, thinking differently, and my brain was working very differently, and it sees the world in a different, spectrum, but it sees it in a different place, of its own, its own reality and its own kind.
Mm-hmm.
And my brain, I actually love my brain the way it thinks, because I can see the world around me, but also I can see the world in me through other people and see their experiences, discussions, difficulties, and, conversations through a whole different set of lens.
I first heard the idea, or someone asked me specifically, autism was not on my radar at all for myself. And but I had gone to see one of my spouse's college friends who I had never met before. And I wasn't a person who shared a lot about myself, but I found through the weekend of hanging out that I was sharing a lot. I was in a really challenging time in my life. And it turns out that 2 years prior, they had been diagnosed with autism. And so the last day we were hanging out, we were in this really, really large restaurant and in New York City. And it was really, really loud and tons of people. And but we had gotten to know each other enough that it was there was this comfortability. And in that conversation, that's when they had said, had you ever considered autism? And I had never. And it didn't even cross my mind. I had very stereotypical ideas of what it meant to be autistic. But they did this thing that really changed my life. They put noise canceling headphones on my head.
Wow.
And they did it, they put it on. And so there was something in the act of this connection with this person. And when they put them on, I think that they could see a shift in me. It was so palpable to have all of the stimulus. And in that connection with them in that moment, it was the whole world went away for a moment. And I think it was really in that moment I knew. And even though I didn't know, but I got excited and I got really curious.
I had come into contact with a blog or something that was written about the alien on the playground, and it was about an adult diagnosed, assigned female at birth person who felt very alienated throughout their childhood. And I read this blog and recognized myself in it. At the time, I was partnered with somebody who had been diagnosed with Asperger's, which is a part of the spectrum, but that's what they were calling it when he got diagnosed. And I found the RADS-RITVO scale online, which is a clinically validated assessment tool. It's correlated between people who have autism and people who don't. And I took it and he took it, and my results wound up being even farther off the charts than his were. And that started me trying to get attention from my medical care professionals that I suspected that I had autism, because it says on the RADS-RITVO, if you score in this range, take this into your doctor to be assessed. I worked for about a year and then wound up in a space for about 4 to 6 weeks where I just couldn't do anything. And
around this time I would consider myself an autistic burnout, and I couldn't really leave the house, and I was having, you know, up to 10 panic attacks a day. Like, it was just, my nervous system was just, everything was shutting down. And that was right when the lockdown happened. And so it was like, it saved my life, it felt like, in a lot of ways, because now all of a sudden there's no social interactions. I don't have to hug anyone. I don't have to set any boundaries for myself. I don't have to be anything for anyone. And it's when I came out of, I realized I had been an autistic burnout.
fundamentally, it took me another couple years to actually get diagnosed with the autism, but reading that article that enabled me to self-diagnose and really started asking the questions was kind of like this kaleidoscope twisting into focus, where everything that never made sense about my life finally started making sense.
I've been suspecting that I was autistic for a long time, or 10 or at least 10 years, maybe, and I'm 60, a little over 60. So I guess I think the thing that's been the most important to me is really sort of finding a community of people.
Right about a year after that, I found ABB, going into the Fox Market, a little market in East Montpelier, and they were donating tips to All Brains Belong for that month. And when I saw that, this is the place for me. This is where I'll start being able to exist in the outside world, because that still wasn't part of my experience. And ABB to me has been a way to have community, have social connections, to understand my body, to reframe mental illness into, autism, to take medicines that, simple medicines that have been able to make my mobility and my ability to be in the world different. And so I would say, like, my therapy gave me a space to be myself in a way to myself, and ABB has given me a way to be myself and in community with others that I hadn't had in so long.
What does being autistic mean to you?
Honestly, the first thing that comes to mind is trauma. I don't want to be a downer or anything, but being an undiagnosed autistic for most of my life, I've had a really hard time with social trauma. I've had death threats as a result of me not understanding either social cues or what people are saying. And I have CPTSD that my psychiatrist has identified is as a side effect of having autism. Other than that, it basically means that my brain has differences in the way that it works and processes information. There are some things that it does really well. There are some things that it really sucks at. But fundamentally, I don't look at my autism as anything that needs to be cured. I look at it as a part of the natural standard deviation in terms of what is normal.
If I had to guess, I would say, from an evolutionary standpoint, that most of us are probably really, really wired to be incredibly sensitive to social context and social cues and what the rest of society wants and needs and what other people are doing. And in a large way, that's great. It helps us to all get along. But if a whole society is off base, then or going in a direction that isn't so good, evolutionarily, there probably needs to be at least a healthy minority of people that are able to not be so wired cued into what the social world thinks. I think that's healthy for society to have that minority. And I think it's really hard to be in that minority because that difference is not at all appreciated in the mainstream.
Can you talk a little bit about the strengths and the challenges that you feel like go along with being autistic?
My biggest, brain strength is insight and knowledge, a world around me, plus the environment, if it's toxic or welcoming. And, for me, that's my biggest strength is, my brain is thinking fast on its feet. And and the way it sees the world's perspective view. My brain's weakness is trying to comprehend or doing too much overriding, comprehending the situation and trying to analyze it in its own way. But there's too much, background brain status noises that it makes it hard for my brain to comprehend on what to focus on.
I'm really, really good at things like pattern recognition. I rely upon pattern recognition for survival. I'm also really good at working with things that are really complex. I have an ability to see both the forest and the trees at the same time.
I guess what it means to me to be autistic is to sort of be a moral conscience or an outlier to the rest of society, saying an outlier or an outlaw to the society I'm living in, saying, I just don't see it the same way you do, and it doesn't make sense to me, and I think you're going in the wrong direction in this way and that way and this other way, and that you could be doing it. And so I'm often on the outs of it, and yet, 20 years later, I'm often not wrong. So, and it's a long time to wait. And by the time everybody else is caught up, I'm usually on to finding something else that I don't like.
Where just people understood things that I just didn't seem to understand. And I didn't know where they were getting the information, had Google existed as if I was a child, I would have been Googling that all day long. Why is it so easy for people to do this stuff? All throughout school, I was a solid, I loved the middle of the school year. You're in your groove, you got your notebook that's already half filled in, you got the rest to go. There's no beginning of the year icebreakers, there's no end of the year zigzags. You're just on your path. And I've always said that about myself. And now I can kind of look back and be like, well, duh, yeah, of course that makes sense. It was comfortable. I knew the rules, I knew the expectations. That's when I tended to be more engaged in class because I understood the expectations. But beginning and end of anything is just so challenging for me.
I can feel like I'm nervous to talk, and that's part of it is the excitement. It can cue on safety in my system. And so I just want to like name that for myself. All of the ways that I had felt different, or been made to feel different around like pickiness, being overly sensitive, controlling, highly anxious. Even though those were all kind of separate points or relationships in my life, all of a sudden it came into this clear view under this one umbrella of this neurobiology, or this difference. I think of it differently now, but and so in that exploration of that, so I had always was, very sensitive. I was always shy. It was really hard for me, but mainly what I was discovering was I had an inside world and I had an outside world. So I would go into the world and I would try the best. I would study human behavior. I was very adept of understanding and really sensitive to energetics within how people were relating, which was often very confusing because I could tell if someone was dysregulated, even though they were acting like everything was fine. But in my social environment with my peers, it was really difficult because I could sense when someone was challenged, but if I pointed that out or I was direct around it, it would often get turned around like something wrong with me. Or
that I've had to work really, really, really hard to actually care about other people, and to actually and to connect with other human beings, and to so I the challenges are I often get in the way sometimes of good things, and maybe many times of good things that other people are trying to make happen, just because it doesn't work for me.
Sure.
And just because I don't understand why it works for other people.
Yeah.
So it's sometimes hard to know when it's really important to take a stand and when it's just like I'm being stubborn and I don't like being left out and I want to do it my way.
I'm exhausted all the time of all of the thought and all of the effort that I have to do in advance to be successful in the future. And I didn't see other people doing that. Like, my husband can get up out of bed 10 minutes before he's got to leave the house. And and I'm like, are you kidding me? I get up at like 5 a.m., even if I'm not leaving the house, just to like prepare myself for the day. I need to ease into my day. I can't just get up and go.
Painful. It's like, oh, I'm always good, and it's the reality of being autistic. It's like I'm always, that's just how my brain works. It works differently than the culture, than most of the people in the culture I am in. And I believe evolution designed it that way. And a thing that I think I would love to see our culture change is the way that we deal with outliers, because I don't think outliers are mistakes. I think outliers are necessary for a society that needs to be self-reflective, and the best of humanity is kind of self-reflective. So I think outliers are a good thing, not a mistake of nature, even though they slow down corporate production.
How is your life different since learning that you're autistic?
All of a sudden, like by sort of saying I'm autistic and learning about the autism community, all of a sudden there's this whole group of people that's like, oh my God, instant sort of social connection that otherwise I would sort of find piecemeal, case by case. And you still have to make friends, but at least it feels like it's like the community itself has the feel of human community, the kind of human community I've been looking for an awful long time.
I'm glad to know, because it gave me more grace with myself. And it also just connected my son and I a little bit more, when I told him, he was like, well, of course, Mom, that makes so much sense. You know me so much more than anybody else. And I'm like, I guess it does kind of make sense. Again, I'm the tree, you're my little apple,
but not being diagnosed as a child, like had to go back through my life and in the grief of that and realizing like, oh, I always cut paper. Like I would just cut paper all the time. I realized, oh, this where's my stems. You know, I watched a ton of TV. It's where I got all my social understanding. I was often like really, like physically my face would change. Like if I was hanging out with somebody, I would start speaking like them. I would take up their interest. But then I would go home and just be very able to be in my own world, listening to songs over and over again. And so when I was taking the quizzes, it felt like someone was entering into my world. Like, how do they know that about me? How do they know that I have a fascination with running water? How do they know that? Like, it was like someone was peering into my soul, and I felt known for the first time in my life, just from reading the questions. So at the time I was in tremendous amount of internal struggle. And so I think what happened for me was I entered into that world. And so I became very quiet and very curious about myself for the first time, because I realized there was this quality of dissociation when I was going out into the world. And I was really doing a lot of work to try and undo that, but I didn't have any awareness of my body. I didn't have any like ability to like self-reflect, in the sense of like, I could self-reflect it, like how did my behavior affect the other person, but I had no ability to reflect, how am I actually being affected by what's happening? And there's a really big difference in that for me. And so I think that was the first time all of a sudden sounds were coming in. And so I wasn't just getting unconscious pain from it. I was actually getting very conscious pain. In fact, my husband one time said, is this getting worse or is this getting better? And I realized for me internally, it was getting better, but how I was living or how I was acting that out was getting worse for the world.
So much of what they're saying is wrong with my kid are ways that I am, are ways of my being. And so I bring that up. I'm like, I think he actually does that because I do that. Like that would make sense to me. I'm a stay-at-home mom. He's with me all the time.
Yeah.
Of course he's going to do that.
Yeah.
And they're like, well, that isn't a thing that, neurotypical people do. I'm like, oh, that's fascinating, isn't it?
Yeah.
And then I met Mel, and things just went from there. And me receiving my diagnosis was such a difference from when my child received his. We were, and I mean it when I say we were literally handed a box of tissues when they said he's autistic. Well, he's on the autism spectrum. Oh. Here's your box of tissues. And like my husband and I are both like, great, thanks for the answer. Like, next step, what do we do?
Right.
And when Mel told me, she was just like, congratulations, you're autistic.
Yeah. And what do you wish parents of autistic children or the broader community knew?
Oh, what do I wish parents or the autistic community broader knew about me? One, I wish they knew that we're all in this together as individuals, that, that sees things differently, hears things differently, and moves things differently. To me, the broader public that are, parents and autistic individuals that knew about me, that I'm very, very compassionate, supportive, and I do take a leadership role when necessary to support those individuals that may not have a voice. They may not even know how to speak, with their voices, or they may not understand what we're talking about, because that's not the way our brains in reality work. Everybody's brain thinks differently and acts differently. And for the autistic community, it's about, understanding other people's brains works and how to connect with that brain and having a meaningful conversation and discussion within that brain pattern of an autistic individual, whether it's parents or children. It's just having that conversation with them makes them feel like they're welcome and a bigger part of the, not only a bigger part of the picture, but a bigger part of the family together. And that I would like to see more of, is that value and welcoming sense of we're all in this together. We all help each other. Let's move forward together so we can, be the best we can be to educate others about, our special strength.
What do you wish parents of autistic children or the broader community would know about what it's like to be autistic?
I think I touched on that also. I just think
Yeah.
it's like, change the perspective on outliers. We're necessary. Let's embrace let's as a humankind, let's embrace the outlier perspective for what we can learn from it, and for what we can learn from seeing life through the eyes of the outlier, through the eyes of outliers that we would never see because we would never see because of the natural bias of the majority.
Yeah.
And the natural and the perspective of the majority, and how the majority is wired, literally wired to see things differently. And so as a culture, if we sort of embrace the idea of the value, the social value that people bring is broader than economics, and we need to bear the burden, we need to gain the benefits and bear the burden of a diverse culture, then we need to find a way to support everybody, emotionally, socially, economically, and make space for all of us, and truly be truly committed to the gifts that each person's spirit is trying to have them offer the world they live in.
One, I wish people just understood that our brains were different, period. It's not something that we can control. But two, don't pathologize the differences, and don't pathologize and or ostracize us because we are non-conforming.
But less of a tragedy,
Mhm.
because
Yeah.
it isn't. Like,
Yeah.
I made it to 46 years old, all the while questioning, but I experienced a very classic, when I told certain family members, "Are you sure? You have like college degrees?" I'm like, "Yeah."
The thing that I would love like people to understand is that first of all, what I'm speaking about today is like my own experience, and that I think it's really important to understand that everybody gets to have their own experience and their own access needs. And even though there may be like traits or characteristics that overlap, that is not actually the experience of being autistic. Being autistic for me means being unto myself, being individual, and allowing myself and whatever my needs are, whatever my sensitivities or whatever my extraordinary abilities be, and it gets to be a collection of my human experience. And I think the other thing in terms of like what I would want like the broader community to understand, or what I would want my family to understand, or parents of autistic people, family members of autistic people, is to that that it's so important to allow difference to be a wonder, and allow yourself to be different within even your relationship to someone who knows themselves to be different, and to be curious and to ask questions and instead of presume. Because I could be having a really sensitive sensibility right now to a noise that's happening. And if there's an assumption of what that noise is, that was not going to help me. But if there's a curiosity around what does that feel like in your body, or could we identify what the sound is, it's such a radically different experience for me. And so I think for me, like even like my face is all red, I'm really flushed, I'm super nervous, I want to be here. Part of that is my excitement, but part of it is having the attention on me. of like, how will I be perceived? You know, am I safe? But also just like, that's not an easy way for me to exist if the tension is directly on me. Like, I've got to find another way, or I get to observe the experience. And so I think it's just really important that folks know and understand that there's no one way, but the more curiosity you can have, less presumption around what people's actually experiencing, it could be an opportunity for openness.